So let's go over a few things before we dive into our discussion today. All attendees will be muted throughout the session, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature, which is located on the WebEx toolbar. We'll monitor those throughout the hour. We love it when you ask questions, so ask as many as you want. We'll have some time reserved at the end to answer those. And just a little bit of background on our firm before we get started. Let's see here. Kirkpatrick Price is a PCI QSA and licensed CPA firm providing assurance services to clients worldwide. Our firm has over 12 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. We offer both regulatory compliance and information security services. We provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, and readiness audits. We also provide guidance and audit services on frameworks such as HIPAA, SOC 1 and SOC 2, PCI DSS, FISMA, and ISO 27001 and 27002. We also encourage you to connect with us by subscribing to our blog, visiting our library of recorded webinars, and following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook so you never miss an update. Our speaker today is Mark Heinley. Mark is a regulatory compliance specialist with Kirkpatrick Price and also a member of the Florida Bar with 9 years of experience in healthcare law, regulatory affairs, and internal compliance in the public and private sectors. His specific experiences include serving in the General Counsel's Office for the State Health Oversight Agency, regulatory affairs for Medicare, Medicaid, HMO, and complex healthcare litigation. He is also SAM certified in the law of data security and investigations. And I'm going to make sure that Mark is unmuted right now so y'all can hear him. And we're going to welcome Mark.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to also extend my welcome to all of you who are participating in our final session in our Risk Management 101 series. I want to give a legal disclaimer. This presentation is provided by Kirkpatrick Price for educational and informational purposes only, and it does not constitute legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is established by viewing this presentation. So should you need legal advice, please consult with your own attorney. Now that we've got the fun part of the presentation out of the way, we can get to the really fun part, which is a congratulations for those of you who have completed a risk analysis. Finishing a comprehensive HIPAA risk analysis is a big deal. It puts you in rare company of those who've actually completed a risk analysis of some kind, and a comprehensive risk analysis. Doing that is even rarer. But we're not quite done yet. So as was mentioned, this presentation is based on the assumption that you've either completed your risk analysis or that you understand what you need to do to complete your risk analysis. So if this is your first time with us in this webinar series, then I want you to stay on. We're going to share some things that will be helpful to everybody, but I want to encourage you to go back and listen to the first two presentations. They're free and they are available on our website. So if you've gone through the process of planning for and scoping out your risk analysis, and then gone through the process of actually identifying risks and threats and vulnerabilities and all the associated requirements to conduct and complete a comprehensive HIPAA risk analysis, then today we want to talk about what you do when you've completed that step. And so we're going to talk about 5 different actions: internal reporting, management responsibilities, corrective action, and monitoring and auditing. The first 3 items are directly part of the risk analysis process. The last 2, the monitoring and the auditing portions, are activities that are required as part of a security management program, but are indirectly served by the risk analysis process. So that's our roadmap for today's presentation. So let's start out with our internal reporting process. So once you have completed your identification of your threats and vulnerabilities, the potential impact, the likelihood of occurrence, your controls in place, your recommendations, and all of those different elements that we talked about in our last presentation and that are the foundation of a risk analysis. We want to talk about what you need to do with all of that information. Specifically, we want to talk about your report format. Your report format should include a high-level summary of the process. The best analogy I can think of to explain this part of the report format is to call your minds to what you probably experienced in elementary or middle school science. Do you remember those science class requirements where you had to do a science experiment with the trifold board, and you had to have every single one of them that I ever completed and that any of my friends ever completed involved the same elements? You had to put a hypothesis, results, procedure, materials, abstract, those requirements that took so long, and most people waited till the night before to cut out construction paper and slather with glue and throw something on there about a balloon and gases or a potato and some kind of growth out of it. So you remember that process. What you're doing is you're explaining to your teacher and to your classmates and to everybody else what you did and how you did it. And you want them to be able to, as part of the scientific method, to independently verify what you did so that they could repeat the experiment and potentially, ideally, get the same results. That's exactly what we're doing with this part of the risk analysis process. The report format should include a summary that is similar to that science experiment trifold experience, where you're telling internal and external stakeholders what you did and how you did it in a way that can be independently verified. So instead of a hypothesis, you have controls and control effectiveness. Instead of results, you have control recommendations. You want to frame what could be a very complex and confusing collection of information in a way that's understandable. First, your audience is the senior level management who is going to be responsible for reviewing this risk analysis and approving it and making decisions on risk. Other parties include operational units that are going to be responsible for implementing recommendations that come from the risk analysis. And then a third audience is external auditors, both in the private sector, whether it's your clients or a third-party auditor hired by yourself or your clients, or the federal government coming in to analyze your risk analysis. So these are the things that the risk analysis are a part of the phase 2 HIPAA audits that Kirkpatrick Price is a part of. It includes looking at risk analysis and including this kind of high-level summary of the process goes a long way in an auditor's understanding and perspective of whether or not the analysis met as consistent with the standards under the security rule. So from a report format level, the first thing we want to include is a high-level summary of the process, like I said, that walks someone through what you did and how you did it so that they can understand the results. A second item is something that's not required, but I think it's something that's useful, and that's either top findings and or what's called a heat map. You've probably seen those in a different format. This is an example of a potential heat map that gives a visual representation of risk. So instead of including all of the threat level detail that the rest of the risk analysis will include, a heat map communicates the likelihood and impact of a particular risk. So it scales the information down to just 2 pieces of information. And then it also serves as a comparative communication to other risks. So in this example, we included just 5 particular risks, and we wanted to keep this very simple and very high level so it's understandable. The goal here is just simply to give you an idea of a useful tool for your risk analysis report format. And here we have the top 5 results, and you can see just visually where they rank individually and then how they compare to the other results. So some of us are visual learners, and also sometimes risk is only understood in its context in relationship to other risks, other threats and vulnerabilities. So this is a fairly complex heat map. Others that I have seen include just, the typical kind of 9-cell breakdown but it includes the potential impact on one side and the likelihood of occurrence on the other side. Obviously, if you include too many threats and vulnerabilities, you're gonna lose the value because it's going to become visually cluttered. But this is a way of drawing attention to some of the top risks that your organization may be experiencing, and also communicating them in a visual way and in a way that is comparative to other risks. So first, you have to include, from my perspective, you have to include a high-level summary of the process to have a really useful risk analysis. The second part of your internal reporting may include a heat map or a list of top findings. The third category or piece of your internal reporting that I would include would be recommendations. And at this point, we're talking about enterprise and project level recommendations, not threat or vulnerability level recommendations. The threat level recommendations should be documented in your risk analysis, and those threat level recommendations should be presented, but they should be presented to the relevant operational units based on the management response to risk. It would be a very exhausting process if your risk analysis is comprehensive to go through the recommendations for each of the threats and vulnerabilities at the management level in some kind of presentation. But at this level of the internal report, I'd recommend various next steps. So you're talking about management approval, corrective action. You're talking about the other items that we included on this, auditing and monitoring as well, giving some kind of description about how those activities should go forward based on this risk analysis. And then a final recommendation for your internal reporting format would be appendices and reference documentation. So any kind of supplemental explanatory information that would be useful to internal and external stakeholders to understand and explain your risk analysis. So these 4 items are part of a report that is separate from the actual risk analysis. So these are 4 things that help explain the content that would be documented most usually in some kind of spreadsheet format. So in addition to this report, this summary and these top findings and recommendations and appendices, you want to include your actual risk analysis, the documentation of all the work that you've done, listing the threats, vulnerabilities, likelihood, impact, controls, and residual risk. Sometimes individuals will also include, or organizations will also include asset lists, threat lists, and policy lists. So the threat list would simply be all of the threats, but broken down into a single repository, a single listing, as opposed to being connected. So sometimes your threats are going to be, you're going to have multiple threats for different assets. So you reduce duplicates, and you get a chance to just look at the threats on their own. The asset list is all of the locations that EPHI is stored, received, or transmitted. And then a policy list is also sometimes useful to understand what kind of documentation you have that would relate to the controls to mitigate risk. So these are some of the things that are frequently included with internal reporting. So ideally, once you've completed your work on the risk analysis, you've documented it in capacities like we just talked about, or similar to the way we just talked about it. And now you have a chance to provide it to management for their review. So the guiding standard for responding to risk is reasonable risk. Specifically, we're required to implement security measures sufficient to reduce risks and vulnerabilities to a reasonable and appropriate level to comply with the requirements under HIPAA. So as we're presenting this to management, as we're presenting our risk analysis to management, and we're considering the kind of steps that we would recommend and that management needs to take, we need to think about reasonableness in the back of our mind, especially if a risk analysis is a new process, both conducting one and reviewing and approving one for management. Because there is the potential for management to receive a risk analysis and think immediately, are you telling us that we have to do all of these things in order to be compliant with HIPAA? And if they think the answer is yes, and they look at some of the potential control recommendations to further reduce risk or mitigate risk, they'll say there's no way that we can do all of this. And instead of approaching the response to risk from a perspective of how can we reasonably and appropriately mitigate risk, they say we can't do it at all, and a risk analysis, instead of being something that's a launching point, a starting point for a compliance program, a security management program, it becomes a dead end, and it negatively influences the culture of compliance within an organization. So it's important when reporting a risk analysis, not just to include the right technical components, but also to communicate in a way that says our goal here is not perfection. So let's give a couple of examples that might help us explain how to approach risk from a reasonable and appropriate level. So one example is there could be a proprietary software solution to mitigate risk to a certain threat or vulnerability. And that software solution, because it's proprietary, costs, and this is, we're going to use extreme numbers and reference points in this example just to make the point as clear as possible. This proprietary software solution costs 3 times annual revenue, and it only reduces risks for this certain threat and vulnerability by 3%, and it would take 3 years to develop and implement. So that could be a legitimate control recommendation that comes out of a risk analysis. But it's likely that management is going to look at that and say there's no way we're going to implement that. But under the standard of reasonableness, from my perspective, that control is not reasonable or appropriate. On the other hand, you could say, well, we recommend implementing a quarterly logical access review for an organization that includes less than 100 people. So let's say for right now, this organization doesn't have any kind of logical access review to evaluate whether access to EPHI is consistent with what was initially proposed for employees that are still with the organization, for employees that are no longer with the organization, for employees and the appropriate level that they need. So let's say an organization doesn't have any kind of logical access process, and so the recommendation is to implement a quarterly logical access review. So that recommendation would include less than 15 man hours to complete every year. It would reduce risk of inappropriate access by 50%, and it could be implemented immediately as opposed to a 3-year lag time. To me, that kind of control recommendation is one that is both reasonable and appropriate to reduce risk. So that's a long way of explaining the type of approach that's needed for both those who are presenting a risk analysis to management for their response, and for management when it's considering the nature of risk and the potential control recommendations. So as we go through this process, we want to always be the ones to raise the standard and the perspective of reasonableness so that the risk analysis is responded to appropriately. So what are some of the options that management has when they're reviewing a risk analysis? They basically have 4 different ways to respond to risk. And this is true. These are kind of general risk analysis concepts. These aren't specific to HIPAA or healthcare. So the first potential response is to accept a risk. If a cost-benefit analysis determines that the cost to mitigate risk is unreasonable and inappropriate, then the best response, which is also a compliant response, is to accept and continually monitor the risk. If the only control recommendation for an organization was, to go back to our example earlier, was that proprietary software solution that was prohibitively expensive and didn't provide much benefit and would take an inordinate amount of time to develop and implement, if that's the only additional thing that an organization can do to reduce or mitigate risk for certain control, then management can say that's a risk we can accept, and we'll just continue to monitor based on our current controls, and we're going to accept that risk. Now, there are two kinds of acceptance for risk. There's passive acceptance, which says that no action is taken to resolve or manage the risk. And you could, as an organization, establish a threshold at which risks can be passively accepted. So you say that risks with a certain score, so if you're going to tie a numerical score to like a low likelihood of impact or a low likelihood of occurrence and a negligible impact, those risks can be passively accepted. That is, we don't need to take any other action to accept the risk other than continually monitor. The second kind of acceptance of risk is active acceptance, where action is taken to manage the impact. That can include preventative measures or contingency measures. And as with passive acceptance, you could establish a threshold that says risks with a score at or above a certain level are subject to active acceptance. So one of the ways that management can respond to risk is to accept it. And as I said, that's a compliant response. As long as the risk is reasonable, the security measures for those risks are reasonable and appropriate. The second way that management can respond to risk is to transfer the risk. So the best response to activities with a low probability of occurring, but with a large financial or regulatory or reputational impact, is to transfer a portion or all of the risk to a third party. So this is an opportunity for covered entities to examine their business associates and consider whether or not there's an opportunity to transfer the risk to business associates. So this requires a level of analysis that says a particular risk, it's most likely not going to occur. But if it does occur, it would have a very, very significant impact to our organization. So we're going to find a way that we can transfer some or all of that risk to a third party. So instead of performing that certain service ourselves, we're going to find an organization that could do it for us and allow them to accept the risk in a business associate agreement for that activity. So the first way to respond to a risk is to accept it, both passively or actively. And the second way to respond to risk is to transfer it. A third way to respond to risk is to mitigate the risk. This is the best response to activities with a high likelihood of occurrence, but the impact is small. And so the way to respond to those kinds of risks is to use management control systems to reduce the risk of potential loss. Mitigation is going to be the bulk of the recommendations for a risk analysis for follow-ups. This is where you're going to find most of your activity and most of your responses to a risk analysis is to say we're going to mitigate risk. We are going to take action. We are going to change our controls or increase our controls in order to respond to this risk because it's very likely that this would occur, but the risk is relatively low if it did occur, if the risk did occur. The fourth and final way to respond to risk is to avoid the risk altogether. Avoidance is the best response to activities with a high likelihood of loss and a high likelihood of occurrence. So instead of doing the activity that causes the risk, but putting controls in place to reduce that activity's risk, this option says we're just not going to do that anymore. So a common form of breach is a lost or stolen device. So how can we avoid the risk related to lost or stolen mobile devices that contain EPHI? One way we could avoid it is just to say we are not going, this is extreme, but this is a way to avoid that risk. We are not going to use mobile devices to access EPHI. A slightly less extreme example, but similar concepts is we're not going to allow mobile devices to store EPHI on those devices, or we're not going to allow those devices out of a physical building or we're going to allow those devices to access ePHI, but not remotely. They have to be within your facilities in order to access ePHI. So it may be that the best response to a certain risk is not to try to add controls to reduce the risk to a reasonable and appropriate level. The best response may be in some cases to stop doing that, to find an alternative way to provide the services that you engage in without exposing yourself to that particular risk. So management will receive the report hopefully with the items that we talked about within it, and that it will go through the process of evaluating the risk and responding in one of the 4 ways. So what happens at the end of management's responsibilities in terms of evaluating the risk? So they go through the documentation review, we want to document management's review of the risk analysis. So I would recommend using standards, kind of like we talked about before, that says our organization's internal standard to accept risk is for risks that have an overall value of medium or low, something along those lines, so that there is a way, like we talked about at the beginning, that science project analogy, to go back through and say, well, if the organization's standard is to accept risk at this level, it doesn't mean you have to. You could always mitigate risk or avoid risk in those cases, but did they ever accept risk that was rated high or extremely high in violation of their own standards? That's something you want to be looking for internally, and that's something that an external assessor would also be looking for. So you want to document how management responds to risks. And then you also want to document at the very basic level that management has approved the risk analysis report, which means a few things. One, it means that management has reviewed the risk analysis, has thoroughly reviewed it, has asked all the questions that need to be asked, has had all the discussions that need to be discussed, and has an awareness of the risk contained therein. That doesn't necessarily mean that management has to understand and know with specificity every single detail about all the threats and vulnerabilities. But they have to be able to say, not only that they reviewed it, but that this risk analysis is a fair representation of our organization's risk environment. And then the final documentation for management responsibility is an appendix. This is one way to do it. There are multiple ways to do it, but a simple way to do this is to have an appendix at the end of the documentation of management review that has names, titles, dates, and a statement that says management has reviewed the information within the report and agrees with it. And that is, from my perspective, a sufficient way of communicating management's review. So now that we've talked about internal reporting and then what management does with that internal reporting, let's talk about our corrective action. So a risk analysis is a great tool to serve as a compliance roadmap. It tells you where you have the most exposure. It should tell you what steps you can take to reduce the areas of greatest exposure, and it can assist in helping with budget requirements. So if you know where your exposure is and you know the steps that need to be taken, you can itemize those steps from a cost perspective to know how much it would cost to reduce the risk that you've identified within the risk analysis. And then those are things that can be done at kind of a high and medium level, but from a really specific level, the risk analysis should include control recommendations that are very specific. They should be identified and documented during the analysis phase. And then, from a best practices perspective, even if you can't do it the first time around, ultimately the ideal is to get to a way that you categorize your control recommendations from a cost perspective, a benefit perspective, and a length of time to implement perspective. So to go back to that proprietary software example and that quarterly logical access review, you can clearly compare those two control recommendations on an apples-to-apples basis and see their cost, their benefit, and then how long it would take to implement them. And this is going to be an area this is going to be a part of your risk analysis, using your risk analysis process that is going to be very specific to your organization. The different control recommendations are going to be as specific and relative based on size of an organization, based on the kinds of services that an organization provides, based on the amount of EPHI that an organization accesses, transmits, or receives, based on previous breaches, based on previous security incidents, based on relationships with other organizations. So those are all different factors that will impact your control recommendations. But this is basically your punch list of what do we do now. Based on management's response to the risk, this says, here's what we do, and here's the priority in which we do it. Again, so we talked a little bit about how management might receive a risk analysis and look at it and say, there's no way that we can do this, implement these controls. It's too expensive, it doesn't provide much benefit, and it takes too long. And the same way, operational units might receive a risk analysis or the management's response and respond in a similar fashion. There's no way that we can do this. We don't have enough resources. Financially, we don't have enough individuals to do this. We don't have enough hardware or software, and it takes too long, and it won't help. So one of the ways that a risk analysis can help, if it's done right during the analysis phase, is to tailor the control recommendations to things that are the most beneficial, that cost the least, and provide are the quickest to implement. So while the control recommendations should be a complete and comprehensive list, a best practice is to prioritize those control recommendations in a way that's going to make them most palatable to everyone within an organization. So once you've completed your corrective action stage, you've now kind of completed all of the steps related to your risk analysis. The corrective action phase is where you actually take the things that need to be done to reduce risk to an appropriate and reasonable level, and you do it. And that is a part of the risk analysis process. It's the next step, but it's directly related to it. But the monitoring and auditing portions are ways that you can use your risk analysis and all the hard work that you put into it and all the resources that are coming from it in a way to develop a risk-based management system. So if you've already identified your areas of greatest risk, then it makes sense to increase your monitoring if it's feasible to address those areas of greatest risk. And there's a couple of ways that you can increase your monitoring for your areas of great risk. So you can increase your frequency. So if you had a quarterly logical access review already and you weren't sure that it was sufficient, you could move from quarterly to monthly or weekly. So you're doing the same kind of testing, you're just increasing the frequency. Another way to increase your monitoring is to increase the intensity of your evaluation. So add tests, add new kinds of reviews or analysis, or enhance existing tests. So increase your sample size or increase the types of data that are gathered within those tests. So, risk analysis enables your security management system to be consistent with HIPAA by giving you a risk-based approach, not instead of, since resources are limited, instead of applying those resources in a random fashion, or even worse, in a fashion that says you monitor the areas of least risk most frequently and with the most intensity, and you monitor the areas of greatest risk with the least frequency and the least intensity. You flip that on its head, and you set your monitoring based on your risk. In terms of the kind of controls that you can use to monitor, I want to talk a little bit about the theories of controls. And these are kind of general management principles based on Robert Simon's concepts from, we're not talking about 30 years ago. You have a couple of different ways that you can you can monitor activity. There are a couple different kinds of controls. The first is a diagnostic control. This is a reporting tool to communicate whether activities are happening when they're supposed to happen. So a couple of examples include audit logs, penetration tests, or the OCR audits. That last one's a joke, a bad joke. But a diagnostic control is a way of saying, is this activity that was supposed to be happening in the way that it was designed to occur? And any good risk-based management, security management system will include a healthy dose of diagnostic controls. A second type of control is a boundary control. So this is a kind of solution that constrains activities. It doesn't just tell you whether or not they're occurring. It actually impacts or influences activities. So think of your access control processes, things like, or processes like new hire background checks, role-based access, multi-factor authentication, a workstation password management, automatic log-off, those kinds of things that actively influence behavior and constrain activity. Encryption, sanctions, those are boundary controls that will assist in monitoring for appropriate behavior. And then the final type of control we're going to talk about for our purposes is belief system control. This is not necessarily a software tool or a hardware tool, or but it's something akin to kind of the culture of compliance concept. And the most tangible and easiest example to use for a belief system control is your security management training. These employees frequently resist and resent security management training, but when you look at enforcement activity and you see the activities that led to security incidents and breach and sanctions, they frequently relate to activities that should have been prohibited under security management training. Now, that doesn't mean the organization's failed to train. It just indicates that there is value in security management training. So a healthy monitoring approach is going to include all the kinds of controls that we've discussed and a balance of those kind of controls. It's going to include diagnostic controls. That's the most obvious. It's going to give you information on whether or not the activities that you want to occur are occurring. But you also want to have boundary controls, things that will actively influence activity. And then finally, you want to have belief system controls in place to evaluate whether or not things are happening the way they're supposed to happen. So our fifth item for today's presentation, and the second that is served by an effective HIPAA risk analysis, is our auditing process. A risk analysis not only provides direction for monitoring activities, but it also provides direction for auditing activities. I want to talk quickly about the differences between monitoring and auditing, because I frequently see, and it's understandable, but I frequently see organizations attempting to do both, but conflating and confusing the two and not realizing that they're not performing both, and they're not getting the results of both because they're not performing both. So monitoring means the review of information provided by an operational unit. So this is something where if you're a covered entity and you had an individual or a group of individuals responsible for handling patient access requests, and they provided a weekly or monthly report of access requests received, granted, denied, and any of the kind of related information to access requests. That would be monitoring. Auditing is an independent assessment of activities performed by someone outside of a business unit. So that it doesn't necessarily mean a third party, someone outside of an organization, but it does mean someone with some kind of independence. You can't have someone who's responsible for for granting access to a new employee have independence in the reporting of whether or not they followed all the requirements in granting access, waiting to ensure that a background check came back clear, making sure that that individual had security management training before they were given access, any other steps that were required. That required to be credible, an evaluation of the process will require a third party, either someone outside the organization or someone within the organization, but who's not responsible for granting access to new employees, coming in and assessing whether or not all the activities that should take place before giving someone access to EPHI actually occurs. So we talked about monitoring, but in this case, we're talking about how a risk analysis can help you with your internal your internal auditing, whether that's something you do yourself or you hire to another organization. And just like our monitoring phase, your risk analysis should inform your auditing program by telling you where your greatest risk is. So the first level of benefit from your risk analysis is that you can tailor and target your auditing based on what you discovered. So where do you need to test based on the areas of greatest exposure? But two other areas of benefit from a risk analysis are auditing to test your risk analysis controls for both existence and effectiveness. So taking your risk analysis to the next level would be looking through all of the controls that were said to be in place and auditing to assess whether those controls are actually in place. So if you have a risk rating for your mobile devices, and that's based on the belief that you have a control in place for a remote wipe, and no one checks and a decision is made by management about accepting that risk based on the belief that a particular control or group of controls is in place, and no one independently assesses whether or not those controls are in place, you might have a risk analysis that is actually is faulty. And so you can use your risk analysis to test whether or not to audit whether or not those controls are in place to independently verify that you have a remote wipe capability. And then the second, whether that capability exists, and then the second phase would be, is it effective? So do you have the kind of controls that we talked about under monitoring, those boundary controls? Are they working like they're supposed to work? It may be that you're able to at some level verify during the risk analysis process that you do have a certain software, or you do have multi-factor authentication, or you do have some level of encryption. But the next level would be, is it working like it's designed to work? And the best way to do that is to independently audit that control. And then your auditing, in turn, while it benefits from your risk analysis activities, it also reciprocates and benefits your future risk analysis activities. So your risk may adjust if the controls that you thought were in place aren't in place, or those controls are in place, but they're not providing as much risk reduction as you previously believed. So you may rate the residual risk of a certain threat or vulnerability based on the belief of a group of controls, and then your auditing may discover that those controls either aren't in place or they're not working like they're supposed to. And so future risk analysis would say, well, we know that we don't have those because we audited against that, or it's not working like we thought. We're going to decrease the rating of control effectiveness, and we may increase our residual risk. And that may impact management's decision. Is the level of risk now to the point where management says we either need to transfer that risk, or we need to mitigate that risk, or we need to avoid it altogether? So there's an important interplay between your auditing activities, both in response to your risk analysis and in preparation for future risk analysis, to assess whether the controls are in place and whether or not they're working effectively. So we've talked about internal reporting, management's responsibilities in response to a risk analysis, corrective actions, auditing, and monitoring. And I want to just give some final thoughts about the risk analysis process. at the end of the day, you're asking yourself, what are we going to do with this risk? Has management reviewed this report, this analysis, and have they agreed to it? And then how can we use this information to improve our monitoring and auditing? Those are the questions that should be asked. The question that's most likely to be asked is, do we have to do this again? Do we ever have to do this again? A mature risk management program includes ongoing and integrated risk analysis. So it's based on activities that occur on a somewhat frequent basis. Activities such as a security incident, or a new product, or new technology, or change in business organization, that is like a sale or a merger. Those kinds of categories would impact a mature risk management process. So that it says, okay, we've had a security incident. We're not going to complete an entire risk analysis of everything based on that security incident, but we are going to include a narrow scope of review based on what occurred. The security rule says that risk analysis needs to be done as needed. So it gives you that great bright line for you to define for yourself. You know, frequently I see recommendations and give recommendations depending on the maturity and needs of an organization of time periods to conduct a risk analysis from every year to, you know, every year or upon some change like we talked about with the security incident or a new technology or product defined by certain characteristics. Or I've seen frequencies up to as infrequent as every 3 years with some kind of lesser level of review in the interim on an annual basis or on an incident basis. The goal is not merely, though, from my perspective, is not merely just to check the box of have we done a risk analysis. The goal is to really identify those threats and vulnerabilities from a compliance standpoint, but even from just a business standpoint, to protect yourself and then also to be able to promote yourself, that you can tell organizations and patients that you work with that they can have a reasonable level of trust based on the kind of self-awareness that your organization has of its own risks and vulnerabilities. So that concludes our 3-part series on risk analysis, planning for it, conducting it, and then using your risk analysis. As we talked about at the beginning, we now have time for some questions. So if you want to go ahead and submit those, I have some closing remarks that I want to provide while you're submitting those questions. First, our mission statement includes educating, empowering, and inspiring to greater levels of assurance. So that's the reason we provide this kind of information in a webinar setting, is because we believe we have a responsibility to educate, empower, and inspire. But we also want to continue our mission of education, empowerment, and inspiring with you in a client relationship. As we mentioned at the beginning, we provide HIPAA risk analysis as a service. So for those of you who heard all this information and said either the whole thing or part of this process seems overwhelming, then let us help you. We also provide policy and procedure work. We also provide auditing services such as SOC 2 with a high trust. And we want to continue our efforts to educate, empower, and inspire you in a way that is even deeper and greater than the kind of information that we can educate and empower and inspire you with in just a 1-hour webinar series. So if you have specific questions about the services that we've talked about or something else, please let us know. Contact me, and I want to be able to help you. Now, our next webinar series, I'm not going to give it away, but I can tell you that it's going to be very good, and it will provide you with some more information about assurance services that we're going to provide that are complex but are becoming increasingly necessary to operate in today's healthcare marketplace. So look for information about our next webinar series coming up soon. So that's all I have. So let's see if we have some questions.
Yes, and I'm just going to say, you don't need to ask if you're going to get the presentation. We will email those out. This is being recorded, so you will all receive the presentation in your email this week. One question for you, Mark. Let's say, hypothetically, the report was presented and management responded with, we can't do it. We can't do all that. So ops proceeded with a predefined action plan that coincidentally addresses some risks, but not necessarily in priority identified in SRA. Now what?
Well, hopefully, it's a good question. Hopefully the predefined action plan was useful, but it sounds like there's a disconnect, and your security management program has a fundamental challenge that's greater than just the responses to specific threats and vulnerabilities. If there is a disconnect between management and operations in terms of its security management approach, then, like I said, I think you have a bigger issue than just what happens with your risk analysis. And that may be another value of a risk analysis, is finding out that the corrective action plans that are taken are different than what management says. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's not necessarily a inherent compliance issue. If management says we can't do all that, and operations finds a way to reduce risk to a reasonable and appropriate level, then at some level you've reduced risk to the right level. But I think from an OCR perspective, an internal perspective, you're still going to have concern about why there's a disconnect between what operations is doing and what management is doing. So I think that the real issue there is not just about the specific threats and vulnerabilities and whether the actions that the operational unit took were the right ones, but why is operations doing something that's different than what management said?
Great. Another question. How is the best way to present this information not only to management but to facilities? We manage over 40+ facilities, and it can be hard to get to train them without having a little of telephone happening.
So I think in those cases, to the extent you can make a good judgment, less is more. My experience is that people even heavily involved in the risk analysis process get overwhelmed by the depth and level of information. So I would suggest the more remote relationship you have with someone, the more targeted and concise you want to be with the information that you provide. At the very least, you can provide that kind of targeted and concise information, kind of like an even further reduced high-level summary, along with the risk analysis itself, so that they can still have that to review on their own. But they kind of, this is why this is important, and this is what you need to do. If you want more background on why you need to do it, look at these threats and vulnerabilities that are specific to your facility, and that will give you some explanation of why these additional controls need to be taken, or why we're accepting risk based on what we understand. I think the why is the thing that organizations tend to need the most, and the details kind of sometimes come second.
Great. Keep sending those questions. We have another one. If we have some controls in place for each threat, does that mean we've successfully mitigated our risk?
So the goal for a risk analysis is not merely to kind of play the match game where you say, okay, we have a threat or vulnerability that results in some risk. We've got to just have something in place, and that way we've complied or we're consistent with HIPAA standards. The goal is to have appropriate risk reduction. In other words, a risk analysis is not a control inventory. It's an internal evaluation that says, where's our exposure, and is that exposure inappropriate and unreasonable? So it's just a starting point. So if you have some controls in place for each threat, that doesn't necessarily mean you've successfully mitigated it. It may, but it may not. But again, the goal is not just to match up a control with a risk or a control with a threat. It's to become self-aware, and that sounds really meta for risk analysis presentation, but that is the goal, is to become self-aware and then act upon that awareness.
Great. That was our last question. So thank you for joining us today. And as Mark said, this entire series is available on our website. You can find it in our webinar library. So be on the lookout for our next series. It'll be coming up pretty soon in April, so be on the lookout. Thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.